Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast. Today, we're going to talk about honoring diastole and why it's important to perform optimally and optimize the function of our hearts and our lives. Just a quick reminder, nothing in this episode should be construed as medical advice. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Gail Wright, who is my co-leader for our Honoring Diastole Retreat at Pine Ridge. She's also a cardiologist, a heart specialist trained in mindfulness, and a seasoned doctor who spent much of her career in the ICU. Our intention for today's episode is to share the concept of diastole, the rest phase of the heart, and where this concept can come up in your life and how it can help you. We hope you'll discover that by honoring diastole, we honor ourselves. And just like our hearts, when we relax and nourish ourselves, we are better able to nourish others. The takeaways for today's episode are that even dirt needs rest. And so we all, just like dirt, need some rest in our lives. And a favorite quote from Annie Lamont, which is that almost everything works again if you unplug it. And so diastole is a bit of a form of a reset and an unplug and a refresh. So with that, Gail, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us how you got into this work?
Well, first, Jessie, it's such a delight to be here. And thank you for everything that you and Ni Chang are doing with the Mindful Healthcare Collective. I invite everyone that's listening to check out more of the activities and join us. I have been a pediatric cardiologist for the past 20 years or so, and most of that time has been spent as a cardiac ICU physician. And in that, we hold a lot of fragility and a lot of vulnerability, and it's a rather liminal space where we quickly become aware of our own mortality as well as other people's. And that over the years taught me a lot about remembering that each day and even each moment we have is really precious. And I also have done a lot of work as a children's heart specialist with kids and then kids into adulthood who were born with half their heart. And I will tell you that those kids and their families taught me a whole lot about living wholeheartedly. And I think what we're talking about today is really about living wholeheartedly and open-heartedly. And specifically with that, I got into mindfulness because I was looking for practices and things that the kids and families could do themselves to boost their own resilience, knowing that they had a lifetime of chronic condition to work with. And what was recommended to me by our psychologists and psychiatrists in the program, they said, oh, actually, there's great things they can take home because the best evidence for decreasing anxiety and stress and post-traumatic stress disorder are mindfulness practices. And they've been studied a lot. So here, why don't you put those into your clinic? And as soon as we started doing that with the kids and the families, and mind you, we can do that with kids as little as 2, and then we did it all the way up to grandparents and everybody in between. As soon as we started offering this for the family, all of our clinic staff, every one of the interdisciplinary staff started trying the practices because it was so immediate to see the beneficial effects. And then pretty quickly after we each tried this ourselves, we started doing it with our own kids and families and started coming back to our staff meetings and saying how much this helped us and how small practices, 2-minute, 5-minute practices really were making a difference in how we showed up each day and the communication in our families and the communication in our team. So that's how I got into it. And then as I went along with that, I had been teaching cardiorespiratory physiology for almost 20 years by this time in a med school and a doctor kind of way, right? And I realized as I wanted to learn more about this, because this was feeling really transformative to me, I don't exaggerate to use that word, I realized that there was this fascinating interconnection between what I was teaching in cardiorespiratory physiology and the teaching of thousands of years of wisdom tradition across continents, across different cultures, centuries of people teaching this in different ways to help people make their way through times of great uncertainty and times when they felt vulnerable and times when people needed to draw together and remember their connection and their collective intentions. And that there were concrete practices that were teachable that we could incorporate and that I could share with others that would help to do that. And just to lead into then our discussion of diastole and also a lot of the mindfulness practices, as you teach, Jess, focus on the breath as one of the home bases. Now, for any of you out there that might be recovering from COVID, or you might have anything else in your life that the breath doesn't feel like a comfortable anchor, then you can put it somewhere else. Like maybe just bring your fingertips together right in front of your chest and feel your fingers there, or perhaps pay attention for a second to your feet on the ground. So there's plenty of other home bases. But in thinking about the breath, in medical pathophysiology and physiology, there were beautiful, literally Nobel Prize winning studies that looked at where the vascular resistance in our whole circulatory system comes to the point of least resistance. And where that actually is, I don't know, do you remember where that is, Jess? You might not, because it's a kind of an ICU geek kind of thing.
No, it's an ICU geek kind of thing.
Right, but it's not, because you're a mindfulness teacher. Right. So where that actually comes,
the lungs would be my guess, right? Or no?
The lungs, and specifically at the end of tidal respiration, which in medical terminology we call functional residual capacity, and in the wisdom traditions we call the piece at the end of the out breath.
Yeah.
So here was this amazing intersection of these different disciplines that now I was floating in and learning in. So, and then likewise, as we start to talk about diastole, and I'll let you talk as a non-cardiologist, and then I can share as a cardiologist, but as we come to that, we remember, and I remember actually you saying this in the yoga class you were teaching, and it was a real aha moment for me, Jessie, as a teacher, because you said, remember where the heart pumps first. And I've now asked this to many, many, many groups of physicians, and almost always groups of physicians, especially neurologists and psychiatrists, but everybody says the brain. But remind us, Jess, as you reminded me in the yoga class, where does the heart pump first?
Pumps to the heart first. You have to take care of yourself first, and it takes care of itself. It's interesting, if we learned all our lessons from the heart, how amazing that would be. And we're going to talk about like the lesson of diastole from the heart, and the heart knows how to take care of itself. And without it, we're not here. And so we may have some lessons to learn from that. I just wanted to reflect back a couple of things you said, but I first wanted to start with delight, because you said what a delight to be here. And I'm delighted to have you here, but I also think that delight is one of the things that has really connected us. And the whole vision of Pie Ranch came from this vision of delight, and a day of delight on a sustainable ranch by the beach and with the coastal breezes and delicious foods. And so delight might feel, I don't know, extravagant or superfluous, but it's actually part of, as you said, a wholehearted life. And oftentimes we don't make room for delight, or we had a previous episode on play, and they're slightly different, but find your version of delight, find the people that bring you delight and the spaces and the places that bring you delight, because there's value in that in and of itself, aside from all the seriousness of mindfulness and how the heart works and why we should do it. Delight is a powerful tool for living a wholehearted and open-hearted life. And really, delight is part of being open-hearted. So the other things that I just wanted to reflect back, and because I find it helpful when I'm listening.
Yes, if you just interrupt me, but what I was just going to say is linking this, it's not decadent. Delight is not decadent. The way I'll express that is that was taught to me by my patients. And by and large, that was taught to me by patients struggling in the intensive care unit, literally struggling for their life, or parents who were deeply grieving a big tragedy. You know, it might or might not work out okay after. The story was usually still unfolding, but certain people, even in the midst of those literally the hardest human existence, considering the loss of your child, the death of the child. They found the small delights in a day. Mm-hmm. And that's when I realized it wasn't decadent, it was sustenance. And these things that we're working on together are sustenance, they're sustainability for ourselves and for the people that we feel called to serve.
I love that. Delight is not decadent, it's sustenance. And I so agree. And I think, if I think back, a lot of the work I do is around these thought patterns that we were taught in our training and high achieving people tend to have. And one of those thought patterns might be that delight is decadent, and that's the perfect word. But if we think about delight and diastole, a sustenance and a healthy way to live a long, wholehearted life, that's super powerful.
Yeah. And getting back then, I love the heart. I love talking about the heart, right? But getting back to this basic idea that the heart pumps to itself first.
Yeah.
And the wisdom of the body in that. And when does the heart pump to the heart itself? It does that when the heart relaxes and fills.
In diastole, since that's our topic for today.
Diastole.
Yeah.
When the heart relaxes and fills is diastole. And when things are so focused in medicine, we tend, in a good way, like we're movers and shakers and we do a lot of great things in the world. We help people. That's really wonderful. I mean, we should actually pause, and everybody listening should just pause and think about what actual a miracle it is that people come together wanting to bring forth compassion and good work like this. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And to do that, we're very outward focused. And I would say that's systole, right? We're pumping outward.
Mm-hmm.
And in cardiology, if there's always hyperdynamic ejection, pumping outward, then the heart actually gets stiff. And there's not enough diastolic filling time. And that actually impairs coronary filling. So just like you were talking about, like we have learned sometimes in our medical training, maybe in motherhood, maybe in many other identities that we have. I'm a first daughter. I don't know if you're the eldest daughter, but as the eldest daughter of 5 eldest daughters, we pump outwards a lot, right? And we think we can do that without pausing. And it has been really helpful to me, at least, to think about the pause and the cardiology as a teacher and the heart's own wisdom as a teacher again, because diastole is milliseconds. Mm-hmm. Think about that, milliseconds. Yeah. What a difference 20 milliseconds makes in the heart's filling, and so in our lives.
That's beautiful.
And so trying to think about which shift. Yeah.
And I think we'll talk about that, like a day of diastole in 365, or even pockets where you can find moments of your own version of diastole. So before we move on to why we called the retreat diastole and why we thought it was so important to call out this idea of honoring diastole, I did want to reflect back a couple things you said, because when I listen to podcasts, I think, oh, that was good, and I missed it. And so these are the things that just popped to my mind that I want to say again, so they go into my mind and hopefully help other people remember them too. This concept that what people have done for millions of years probably has some merit. And I actually just like to think about it that way, without even thinking about all the pathophysiology. It probably has merit, probably worth trying, even if we can't explain it in our paradigms yet, because I see many of us who have a science background say, well, is it evidence-based? Where's the studies? I want to know. I have a colleague who I often talk about the hand to heart and compassion, and one of the studies behind it to prove it. And there are studies, first of all, and I'm happy to share them. And I like to think like this is something that we know is good for us. And so sometimes as people who work in these high stress professions, we can just let go a little bit and say like, wow, this is something that's been done for millions of years. There may be some merit. And if there isn't harm, why not try it?
Yeah. And though there are hundreds of thousands of allopathic medicine papers, and there's really clear data on a number of different fronts, whether you want to talk about our own, if you want to think about it from a performance, like I do work with teams and organizations, And some of the reasons that CEOs and CMOs want us to come in. So for example, the pediatric cardiac ICUs that I work in, cardiac surgery is the breadbasket of every children's hospital. That's where the revenue comes in. And so when that team can function at a high level, that allows us to serve more patients, which is ethically and service oriented, a great thing, as well as to generate revenue for the hospital to keep the roof and the mission going, right? So these practices also have been shown. So basically, in many, many other professions have studied this and looked at this in terms of self-monitoring and recovery being important to being key to optimal performance. And so it's now been looked at in healthcare that these practices improve communication, they improve team interactions, and then that translates actually into improved interactions with patients, patient satisfaction, decrease in serious safety events, things that start to get on anybody's dashboard, whether they're the furthest person from talking about anything that has to do with wisdom tradition, it should be on the dashboard. That's my own little soapbox.
And it improves your family life, as you mentioned too, right? It improves teams and
improves your life
I was just talking wherever you practice it and wherever you learn the tools, it's of value.
Well, and that's why I said the reason that people in our clinic adopted it wasn't to show somebody else externally. We weren't trying to meet a dashboard. We just noticed the difference. We could see it in people. We could see it in the families when they came back for their things. And basically, it was kind of one of those, I want one of what she's having moments, right?
Yes.
And if you look around that, a lot of the people that practice this deeply, right, they come across as really joyful people. And again, it's not because they're spending the day finger painting.
Yeah.
But
that's what I've learned through this work is that you show up differently and people say, well, what happened? How did you do that? What are the tools? And that's really what we try to share in our work together is to give people a day of respite and a day of diastole, which we know is functionally now important for performance and communication and living an amazing life, but also to give them tools so that they can then figure out how to incorporate this into their lives. So I wanted to transition a little bit to this idea of why we decided to call our retreat and our work together, so far at least, honoring diastole. And what was really fun about this is Gail as a cardiologist and me as I'm not a cardiologist, I'm a pediatrician. So we have the children bond, but we had a bond over this idea of diastole. And I had done many a yoga class on the idea of the heart spends 2/3 of its time in diastole. And that is, if you're looking at, running the marathon of life, your heart is pretty darn smart. And the idea that we already mentioned that when your heart relaxes is when it fills and when it feeds itself, and it feeds itself first. And without adequate diastole or relaxation, we can't have effective systole and we can't have the effective pumping to nourish the rest of the body, but also to function optimally and to communicate optimally and to take care of our children optimally. And I think in both of our training and our life experiences in medicine, there was very little time spent honoring diastole. And my DIRT quote in the beginning that I mentioned just struck me as so relevant in that I was visiting a sustainable organic farm. And I, of course, sent Gail this message because we like to do our work on sustainable organic farms. And they were talking about farming practices. And they actually give the DIRT. He said, well, this part of the farm is resting right now. It needs 6 weeks to rest in order to function and give the crops what they need to grow. And so there was like a resting stripe and then the beginning seedling stripe and then the beginning, the full growth stripe. And it just struck me that even DIRT needs time to rest. And yet in medicine, there was no conversation about humans needing time to rest. And so it just brought back this full force, this idea of honoring diastole, and DIRT gets diastole, but people in healthcare also need diastole. And honestly, everyone in the world needs diastole. I think in our culture, diastole is not glorified. Systole is glorified. And so can we get back to this idea? And that for me was the idea of honoring it, is that we need to change the culture around diastole. And it's not necessarily just rest. It's a very functional rest, a rest where we replete and we intentionally refill and we intentionally nourish, if you think about the heart nourishing itself. And so that's my perspective on it as a non-cardiologist. I think we've talked a little bit about the cardiology perspective, but I'm interested to hear your thought as to how all of this blends together in your mind.
Well, the first time I used the term honoring diastole as a title for a Grand Rounds talk, and that was honoring diastole, healing for our own heart. This was given, to a group of doctors as a regular Grand Rounds, and introducing the kind of concepts that we're talking about. And then we've shifted into also using it in the retreats. I gave a professional intro. I didn't give the intro that I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a dairy farm on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and spent my entire childhood and adolescence there, and working on the farm and showing calves and 4-H and things like that. And the idea of renewal and the natural cycles. So, we were talking about the natural cycles of tidal respiration, but I also grew up near the Chesapeake Bay, and now I live near the San Francisco Bay and Atlantic Ocean, and now the Pacific Ocean. And this idea of tidal rhythms and cycles in our own life cycle, like the heartbeat, but broader too. And the other thing that I think for me has been a very empowering and sort of strengthened me from others is remembering how interconnected we all are. And even interconnected at this time when we've been spatially distanced. Like, I'm having a grand old time talking to you this morning, Jessie, and we're not physically together. And likewise, friends all over the globe and colleagues all over the globe during this pandemic, and remembering that interconnection. And in our workplace settings, that really gets back to remember the why, remember why we started. And when we take a moment to pause, almost everybody I know that works in a hospital and clinic, and that is literally inclusive of the people that open the door and greet people, the unit clerks, social workers, doctors, nurses, CMOs, anybody. They do that with intention. And they do that, the clinicians particularly, with a sense, whether they can really articulate it or not, but when they let that in of a call as healers. And this is a very long lineage that we're a part of and that we can draw on. Now, as you said, like many lineages, there are parts of identities that are not liberating to us. And this idea that was certainly actuated in our, and is still actuated in our practices, that we can or should ignore our own bodies and our own bodily needs. Like, we don't need to have lunch, we don't need to eat, we don't need to go to the bathroom, we can stand in the OR for 12 hours, and et cetera, right? Or we can work 40 hours, yada, yada. Those were real experiences. Those weren't imagined and projected or catastrophized experiences. Those were lived experiences for us. And they continue to be lived experiences for many of our colleagues. And that's why we also have to keep working on systems change. And sometimes people say, oh, you're doing all this wellness stuff, this kind of fluffy, we need to be going out on systems change. Well, to that I say, I am with you, brother and sister. Okay. And I've been trying to make systems change in medicine as well as our broader society to rid them of the big isms. So we'll just generally say various prejudices, right, that are hurtful to us all. I have been trying to do that my whole adult life. It hasn't all worked yet, and nobody's made me queen. So in the meantime, I actually want to be happy every day. And I want to actually also bring a little joy to the lives of the patients that I see. And I want to be open to the teachings. Like I just was talking about these amazing parents that I work with who, despite terrible tragedies, somehow see the good and somehow appreciate the small delights. I want to be alive enough to receive that and see those gifts. Now, meanwhile, I hope that if I and others around me, as we're teaching these practices, can be a little more thoughtful in our responses to things. And I'll speak for myself, less reactive. I'm a really passionate person. I'm a really emotional person. That's a really good thing. That's gotten a lot of good things to happen in the world because of my passion. And sometimes it's been hurtful to me and the people around me. And I have found these mindfulness practices, even starting with little practices, to be so helpful in that. And that's why I decided to become a teacher of it. And when I first started, I didn't think I could sit still. That's, if you can hear in the background, that's my grandmother speaking up. That's my grandmother clock that's inherited from my grandmother. Sometimes she chimes into these types of conversations. And when
She's
I'm
welcome
teaching,
to join us.
So she'll join us. So I didn't think, I think she's joining when I'm talking about impatience, because I get my genetic impatience from that grandmother. I didn't think I could sit still for 90 seconds, you know, and definitely I wasn't like a monk. And so people ask me a lot, well, how did you start? How can I start? And what I would offer to this, and this gets back to this idea of like milliseconds can make a big difference. I started with 90 seconds. Like I was teaching the 2-year-olds, the attention span of a 2-year-old, right? But then it was 2 minutes. And the thing that actually for me has stuck pretty well that I would offer as a nice one is the idea that we all brush our teeth for 2 minutes, most of us, right? And we recognize that dental hygiene is a good thing, right? And 2 minutes in the morning and 2 minutes in the evening, we pretty much make time for it. Maybe not on call, but most of the time. And so this idea that we could brush up our awareness and maybe brush away a few of the worries and brush away a few of the stories that we create, not just what's here, right here now that we are dealing with, but the way we make a big story out of it, or at least I should say, I make a big story out of it, right? That we could kind of brush some of those away and let them go. And so 2 minutes, the idea of brushing up the awareness. And then for me, I took from that, that's literally how I started. And then I took starting to try to do 5 minutes in my car as I parked in the parking lot on the way into work. And in that, I almost had to do a little Jedi mind trick. Some people think of these as Jedi mind tricks. I love Star Wars, so I like Jedi mind tricks. So it was a little Jedi mind trick, right? Because all my other teaching was like, I got to get into work. You know, I don't want to be late. I can't see time for this. I don't have time for myself. All these stories, right? You can tell even the way I relate them right now, they sound like spinning, right? There's a beautiful Sanskrit word that I love because it's so onomatopoetic. It's vrittis, V-R-I-T-T-I-S. And vrittis literally means the spinning thoughts in our mind. So taking 5 minutes to let go of some of the vrittis, to let go of some of the stories, to let go of getting my kid ready, to get ready, my lunch ready, who I had to arrange for pickup after work because I was working and I'm a doctor and I'm going to call tonight, and how is dinner going to get made, and, you know, how is everything going to work? To even let go of those important responsibilities and commitments to be able to walk in the door to meet my patients, or better yet, the first staff member that I saw, right? And my patients with what we really like to think of as attending presence. We're attending physicians. Yeah. So thinking about being attending.
That's the same thing that I offer through all my coaching work is do your mindfulness. I actually we've talked a lot about transitions recently, doing it in the transition. So the transition from home to work and work to home, and the 5 minutes in the car, in my experience, is the perfect spot because there's no one bothering you. No one really knows where you are. It's like that limbo time. And yet it's this most powerful time to align yourself, set yourself up for success for your day at work or your evening at home. And giving yourself that tiny gift, like tiny moments of diastole, is super powerful.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to share. My Jetty mind trick was like, I would have been like, oh, well, if I'd gotten called because I'm on call and I had to sit in the car for 5 minutes because I couldn't hear while I was walking or carrying my backpack in, then I would take that call for 5 minutes. So that's because I considered that part of work. So now if I consider actually getting into the right mindset and, clearing out my self and wanting to bring my best presence into work, I consider that part of my work. That's part of preparation to being a great doctor.
Well, and diastole is part of our work. It's part of our heart's work. It's equally important. In fact, it's more than half of our heart's work is diastole. And yet we don't think about that as the work. We only think about systole as the work. So let's pivot for a little bit and just talk about the components of some of the things that we share as part of honoring diastole and why, because I think there are tools that people who join us learn while they're there, but they're tools that people can use in different places in their lives, whether they're able to join us on those days or whether they just want to try something out or they want to join us in some other way to learn about these things. And so during our honoring diastole day, our day of delight, we do yoga, we do reflective writing, we do mindful coaching, and we eat really, really well. And we learn about things and we learn about sustainable farming and sustainability, and we're in nature all at the same time. I think that covers it, though there's actually probably quite a bit more to it. But those were the components that I sort of wanted to talk about that we have been intentional about including, and please add something if I forgot something. And to me,
walking, meditation, other mindfulness.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the yoga and meditation, in my mind, they sort of come together, but it's an intentional practice. And to me, the yoga and meditation seems really obvious as a moment of diastole. That's how I like to think about it. And so many people, I think that, oh, well, I get that. That's rest. It's taking care of yourself. It's self-care. I just like to call out that it's incredibly important self-care, whether we do it for an hour to an hour and a half, like we do on a day of diastole, or a minute or a minute and a half, or 10 minutes and a half, whatever you can do of the mindfulness and meditation and or yoga. And for me, the yoga is not about standing on your head. It's really about the breathing, as you talked about, because breathing shifts energy. It shifts your attention. It bathes your whole body in sort of wellness and oxygen and all the physiologic things that we need. And so I think that's something that we've talked about a lot in this podcast, and hopefully most of our listeners are familiar with. I think the pieces that are a little bit different in thinking about them as a form of diastole or nourishing yourself or caring for yourself is how reflective writing might tie into that, how coaching might tie into that, and how the being in nature and in a place that's very committed and aligned is what I like to think with this idea of sustainability, because I think we talk about sustainability for ourselves, for the practice of medicine, and for the earth. And when you're in a moment where you're in alignment, thinking about the heart when it's in diastole, if it's functioning well, is in pretty good alignment. Now, all the arteries are clean and clear and all of these things. So maybe you could reflect initially on the reflective writing, and then we'll pop into each of those other categories.
Well, it's funny, before you just said alignment, Jessie, I just wrote down alignment. And
alignment.
Exactly. What I was going to say is, I think why we do start with the physical practice is that it is a day of kind of shifting focus from the outer to the inner, and then being able to come back to the outer. And in the mindful movement practices, and I say that more broadly because there are people like us that love yoga, and there are other people that love hiking, and other things that they might do on days different than our retreats. But we do it as yoga on our retreats, right? And in yoga, it's this place, finding the place between effort and ease. And that's the place of alignment, right? And when we do this in these physical practices, that actually gets us out of our head. And it gets us into our body. And that then lets us remember these natural things inside of us that we all already have. It's not that some point earlier you said everybody needs diastole. Everybody has diastole. We already have these things inside of us, which is a process of remembering. And you probably know, like Brene Brown talks a lot about armoring ourselves. And we get very armored in medicine, and sometimes that's necessary, and sometimes it's a not helpful adaptation, maladaptive. And these practices that we start, I think, in the morning of that day, and even just coming on to the farm, it's the idea of taking the superhero cape off, right? You just talked about that in one of your recent podcasts. If anybody hasn't listened to it, go listen to it. It's a good one. And a place where we can take off some of the masks, and we veil ourselves and we mask ourselves a lot. And so the reflective writing part also is our writing, and the types of questions and types of things we do allows us to flow and get into a flow that's not our strategic planning mind. And we spend an awful lot of time, a little over the edge, towards strategic planning in medicine. Now, come on, like in the ICU, I have to do strategic planning, or even as an outpatient cardiologist, we need those skills. But as my friend, Dr. Bruce Feldstein likes to say, we have a corpus callosum for a reason. We're supposed to go back and forth between our spacious, creative, innovative right brain and our strategic planning brain. Okay, so some of these practices at the beginning of the day then get us into, in the writing, gets us into this other place where that hopefully lets us think about some things that we haven't thought about in a while.
Do you want to share a little bit, because I love the story, and it's in part why we've connected, how you got into the narrative writing and your connection to Rschel Naomi Remen, who is someone who taught me like my first year in medical school. And so I just think the connection is beautiful. And it's possible that some of our listeners know her work and some of her books, and how I'm assuming she's a big influence in your narrative reflective writing story.
Well, Dr. Rschel Naomi Remen is a huge influence in my whole life. I'm incredibly grateful for her presence in my life. And she has taught me a remarkable amount about generous listening. And I think that's what we're trying to bring in these open-hearted ways. And she is a masterful storyteller, to be sure. But what she really, really is different than so many people is that I think she is able to come to a place of presence, that she listens so generously when you're with her that one can't help but feel seen and known. And that's really a profound presence. And she would be the first to say that we all have the ability to do that, and that we have to practice generous listening to get to that place. And that then when we do it, the places where, for everyone else, like we're creating this in our spaces, in our workplace, the places where people are seen and heard and known, she says, are actually holy places. And that's what she says about our clinic spaces and our hospitals and certainly our homes too. But
having done a reflective writing workshop with you, I think that is actually one of the biggest pieces of it is, as you say, I'm not a writer, but you only have to be able to write a list. And when you asked the questions and then people shared, I very much felt that I felt seen and known in a way that I hadn't. And I think that everyone sharing the experience does. It's just this incredible moment of presence, not only feeling seen and known, but being present and seeing and knowing other humans. And that is that piece of connection that I think we've really, that's just struggled during the last few years of a pandemic, if I might say that, without getting into other parts of the world. So I think the other piece of the retreat, we do a section on mindful coaching. And I think it's also a form of mindfulness as I see it. And it's really about the awareness that you were talking about, awareness of the stories and awareness of our patterns and our habits, especially the ones that maybe aren't so helpful. And so it's a moment to pause and be present. That's why I call what I do pause and presence. And then once we have that sort of seeing and knowing and noticing and awareness, we can decide mindfully and intentionally how we want to move forward. And we can decide mindfully and intentionally how we want to direct our mind. I was in a coaching session this week, and this idea came up again that I think is beautiful. Our unmanaged minds goes to the negative. So we need to give our brains a direction or a specific attention. As you were saying, we're attendings when we're practicing medicine. And so when we show up with a specific, can't think of the right way to say this, but an intention for our attention, or attending with intention, whatever those combination of words are, that is where we can really shift our lived experience. And so that's how I see that as a key component. And it takes diastole. It takes the calm of having been in a beautiful place and practiced some yoga and taken some breaths. And when you're in that spot is where your brain is really very much willing to notice without judgment and be willing to move forward with what I call mindful intention.
Well, I think the other piece that you haven't yet stated is the other part of mindfulness, as well as paying attention on purpose to the present moment, is with curiosity and kindness.
Yes.
And the mindful coaching part that you do is often, I think, giving people a key to reflect back on themselves with more compassion and kindness, and being able to, this gets back to Rschel, actually. Rschel says, if you wonder about things, you don't have to worry as much about things. That was one of her beautiful teachings. So meaning, whether you're living with a chronic disease, like she has Crohn's disease, or any number of people, all of us are living with some vulnerability, right? And we might worry about that, right? But if we then can see, oh, it's unfolding. And Rschel says, thank goodness it doesn't turn out the way I thought. Like, we get upset that it doesn't turn out the way I thought, but thank goodness it doesn't turn out the way I thought, because how I was thinking was so narrow. You know, she's like, if you would have told me, she's like, first of all, people told me when I was 16 that I was going to die when I'm 30, and I'm 83 talking to you right now. So that's a miracle, right? She's like, I never would have thought that from what everybody told me. And then she said, you know, I wouldn't have thought I would have ever written a book or told people, or that anybody even wanted to listen to my stories. So, you know, insert your own specifics that are part of your dreams. But a lot of times we don't live into our bigger selves. And the picture frame that we thought was going to be the perfect picture frame, you know, people often think about this like your wedding picture. And then what happens when, like, our beloveds, it doesn't look the same as the picture frame in our minds, right? And I think you did a podcast recently on long marriages too. So loving relationships over a long time, as well as loving work relationships that we work. Like, I was kind of the partners with cardiac surgeons as an ICU doctor, for example, and there are many other partnerships we have, but are recognizing that we're all growing. But my point being that the picture that actually can unfold, and the beautiful mysteries and wonderful things that can unfold, are bigger than our picture frame. And so these pieces that I tend to really hold on to disappointments when things don't turn out the way I thought they were going to, whether it's for my love life, whether it's for my son, whether it's for my job. And yet, you know, one of the beautiful things about having lived a few decades is that you actually realize that a lot of times, as you know, you go around the corner, what's actually around the curve you couldn't see, and it's so much more beautiful than what you were aiming for.
I love that.
You know, even getting to have this lovely conversation. Yeah. You know, if you'd asked either of us 5 years ago, we might not have dreamed this up, or we would have only really subconsciously dreamed this up. And so I think both the reflective writing and the mindful coaching let us open up both to remembering this lineage that we're a part of, remembering, you know, maybe drawing on the strengths of our ancestors in bigger ways, you know, for intergenerational trauma and other big societal things that many people are working through, and remembering the lineage and how our good intentions as a set of healers is a strength to draw back on, and then the beauty of how things unfold even better than we thought they might. You know, we think about this parenting all the time, right? people get this idea of like what's going to happen with their kid and what they're going to decide. I have an 18-year-old. What a beautiful moment in life. You have two emerging man cubs also becoming young men. And, they're going to do beautiful things that even in our wildest dreams for them as mamas, we didn't dream up for them because it's their story. And sometimes the really hard things that happen. I mean, this is a really big teaching from my patients. Sometimes the really big hard things, people make meaning in their lives from hard things. Tragedy and hard things are part of our lived experience as humans, as much as I'd like to resist it.
I think that is really a key piece of the day, is sort of deciding what meaning you want to make of your life. And so I want to reflect, and I'm going to say we should do it quickly because I know that we've been talking a long time, and many of you have probably arrived at work and are maybe having to turn us on your way home if you're listening while driving. And so we wanted to talk a bit about why we do it in nature and why sustainability is important. And actually, I think we've popped many of the thoughts already through the podcast. And the first piece of this I want to reflect on is just the driving component. If you're driving and if you've arrived, and sometimes I sit in my car and finish listening to things, but thinking intentionally, the driving part can be a little bit of honoring diastole. Both Gail and I reflected as we got on here that we sometimes listen to mindfulness stuff while we're driving. We're not actually practicing mindfulness, but we're using it in that way. And that can be a way of honoring diastole. And honoring diastole can be a few breaths. It doesn't have to be hard, and it doesn't have to be complicated. And I want to offer that, though we, of course, want you to join us, and we both love nature and will, of course, share our thoughts on how amazing nature and sustainability and alignment is to achieving an optimal diastole, if there's such a thing, or just enjoying it more. It's not necessary, and it's sort of gravy on top, and or even the nature on its own can be part of achieving diastole restoration and healing. And there's so many lessons from nature in it. So allowing the thought that it doesn't have to be complicated to do this, and that there are lots of tools that we share during the day. We share the actual experiences because we know that we learn by experience. And that's actually one of the things that we talk about in the CME, that the CME learning folks understand now that experiential learning and reflective learning is where we learn. And so that's how we do our CME credit for the retreats, but it's also actually what we do in the retreat exactly. It just came to mind, the alignment of that, which is intriguing. So I would like to just reflect, because as all of our listeners know, I love nature. I love being in nature. I love sharing photos of nature. And the nature at Pie Ranch is just, for me, even the drive down there is part of the nature, and looking at the view and realizing that there's so many lessons in nature to help us retell our life stories differently. And the lessons of seasons, being part of a bigger ecosystem, and seasonality, and all of these things. And then the piece that is added in at Pie Ranch, which is a little bit different than the other two places that I host retreats, is the sustainability piece. And so Green Gulch is a Zen mindfulness center, and Gail will be joining me there, or will have probably by the time this airs. And so Grada is really more about wellness, and it's just a very different focus. It's neither mindfulness nor a sustainable farm, but for me, it's the most beautiful place to pause and be present on a mountaintop and really experience and live and soak in and nourish the nature. Pie Ranch has all of that, but what it has, which is a little bit different and offers this, is the sustainability piece. It's an actual working sustainable farm with lots of lessons from the farm itself. And eating the seed to table food has its own lessons. And so those are my initial thoughts. And I'd love if you want to add just a few thoughts before we get on to our reflection questions about why you love Pie Ranch and sustainability and nature, and how it's part of our mindfulness, wellness, healing, heart-centered, wholehearted life.
Well, I think it gets fundamentally back at the rhythms of life. Like we're talking about noticing the rhythms of our breath, we're tidal flow of our breath, we're noticing the rhythm of our own heartbeat. People might even want to take a hand to their heart right now, or sometimes I say put a hand on your own heart, like you might put your hand on the back of your patient's shoulder when you're listening with your stethoscope, for example. And this idea of tidal flow, and that in our lives, in our days, each day, moment to moment, things are changing, you know, and there's a lot that comes back around. I personally don't believe that our lives are linear. I think there's a lot that is cyclic in that. And the other piece, you know, I took for my wellness work, I actually work under the title Redwood Resilience. And that is related to Pie Ranch too, because Pie Ranch was very affected by the CZU fire in 2020. And behind us, behind the beautiful orchard or the flowering sunflowers, and behind the view looking incredible vista looking out at the ocean, there is a mountain behind that that was scorched in the CZU fire. And the redwoods, to me, have been big teachers here in Northern California. And that's because when you look at them, I mean, fire is part of their life cycle, right? And loss, and in a way, fire metaphorically is part of our life cycle too. And those redwoods that have been around for centuries, they have burned areas. And they also have these other knobby areas that probably are some little abnormal growth there, right? But when we walk up to those trees, we don't walk up to that tree and go, oh, look at that kind of burned area in the middle. That must have been a terrible, century. Or, oh, look at that knobby. We walk up to those trees and experience that with a sense of awe. And so in our lives that also have fire and loss, how do we learn to stand tall with dignity and grace and drink from the clouds? And for me, when I come,
can you say that again? How do we learn to stand tall
with dignity and grace and drink from the clouds, like the redwoods? That's why it's Redwood Resilience, right? This is the resilience that nature, that Mother Earth herself teaches us.
Beautiful.
And for me, when, like literally the last time we went there to have a retreat, Jessie, I pulled into the driveway. There's a farm stand right on Route 1. And I pulled in. I went to put up the little sign to say where to go to our retreat. That says, you belong. And then there were these beautiful orange nasturtiums there by the stream. And I stopped there, and all of a sudden a little hummingbird was there. And the hummingbird stayed there, and it stayed and it stayed. Usually they flit away, right? I mean, talk about a heart. That little birdie's heart beats 300 times a minute. But anyway, the bird stayed there long enough for me to even take out my camera and even to video it. But here it was immediately, the first second I had gotten there, part of something bigger than myself. And here was this hummingbird literally drinking the sweet nectar of life. So if this little bird that's like 2 inches, having to beat its little heart 300 times a minute to foster life, if that little bird could do that, maybe I could do that. And maybe I could be there with those nasturtiums, or finish walking up the lane to the line of eucalyptus trees and the pine and the redwood, or there were the seagulls. So for me, it immediately helps me remember that I'm part of something bigger.
That's perfect. And the perfect place to end, I think. So as we usually end, I just want to pose a few reflection questions. How can you honor diastole in your own life in little and big ways? Perhaps a few breaths. Might 5 minutes of stretching be possible? Might you listen to mindfulness rather than the world's problems on your way to work? Perhaps you can pause and practice 5 minutes of mindfulness before you arrive and attend to your work for the day. Or perhaps you can do so on your way home. What just might happen to systole if you slow down and pause and are present? And there will be information in the show notes about how to find Gail and a link to her business, Redwood Resilience. She not only does these retreats with me, she also works with individuals, she works with teams, she works with organizations, she helps with team building and professional development and resilience building. And my favorite, reconnecting to joy and meaning. And I think awe and wonder is in there somewhere too. So I'm going to throw that in there. And so I highly recommend checking her out. And she does a lot of grand rounds talks and things about grandmothers and fun music and dancing too. So she's got a lovely super spirit that I think you will all enjoy. We do our own retreat, but we have been asked and are taking on doing retreats for specific departments together. So offering this experience for your department or a variation thereof, because we know it will be helpful for patients and for you. And because really it's a day of delight for everyone that joins, and we aspire to bring more delight to the world. And so we would love it if any of you joined us for Honoring Diastole. There are 2 upcoming retreats so far scheduled this fall, September 24th. We have a few spots left in that one, and we've just added November 12th, which is a beautiful time of harvest and changing seasons on the coast. So we would love to have you join us. And we will, of course, be doing some more next year because we would like more days of delight with more beautiful, amazing humans in our lives to come. Stay on after the sound of the singing bowl for a short mindful moment, which Gail will be leading. And if you enjoy the podcast, please, please, please leave us reviews, share with other people. We know it's helpful. And the best way to share things like this in the world is to spread the wealth and let other people know. So we would be grateful if you would help us do that. And I will say that this week, we will surpass 40,000 downloads because we're extremely close. And that's pretty cool. So I will say that I never thought I would be a human who had a podcast that had 40,000 downloads. So thank you all for listening and downloading and doing all the sharing, following, liking, whatever all that stuff is. I really appreciate it, and keep doing it, because if 40,000 more people can hear messages as important as this, it will be our contribution to changing those systems and changing the world, one person at a time. So please listen. And as I mentioned, stay on after the singing bowl for a short mindful moment with Gail.
Let's clear our slates a bit from whatever has been going on earlier in the day. Creating space to listen to our own hearts. Just take a moment to put down anything you're holding on to. If you like, you may do this standing if you're able, or if standing isn't comfortable or possible, that's fine. Maybe try out a position different than you've been sitting in so far today. For right now, I invite you to practice with your eyes open, maybe with a light gaze away from the screen, as if you're standing in your office looking at the bulletin board or the clinic hallway in the midst of any workday with activity going on around you. Allow your mind to rest, as if resting gently on the heart. Allowing attention to come into the body. Maybe place a hand on your chest or your abdomen, as you might kindly put your hand on your patient's shoulder or back when you listen to their breath and heart. Notice the steady rhythm of the heartbeat, the tidal flow of breath. Such a blessing to breathe easily. And if the breath doesn't come easily, a reminder that this too will change soon. Bringing ease to the shoulders, letting the weight of work in the world slide right off, loosening the neck, lightening and lengthening the spine, gently moving your shoulders back and opening your heart space. Feeling yourself grounded on your feet or seat. You may sway a little, maybe lifting and wiggling your toes. Breathing in that which nourishes you and gives you life. Breathing out that which no longer serves you. Releasing. Resting. Opening to your own awareness. Expansive. Spacious. In this moment, right here, right now, our presence is enough to heal. Now begin to gradually return to the rest of your outside day, bringing with you this sense of spaciousness and a little kind attention. And when you're ready, let yourself return and place your attention to your next moment.